Listen, ya boss. This one starts with a phone call that lasted 47 seconds. 47. Not 48. Not a minute. 47 seconds before everything went straight to hell. It was October 18, 2019, in a small Oregon town about an hour outside Portland. Daniel Mercer was 39, divorced, living alone in an old family house on Bellwether Road. He worked remotely, rarely went out, and had one annoying habit: whenever something scared him, he pretended it didn't. At 11:43 p.m., Daniel called his sister Rachel. "Are you awake?" She told him she was. "Good. Don't hang up." Rachel immediately asked what happened. Daniel didn't answer. She heard him walking across the upstairs hallway, then a floorboard creaked downstairs. "Someone's downstairs." Rachel laughed because she thought he was joking. Daniel didn't. He told her he'd been hearing noises for almost 20 minutes. At first he thought it was the furnace. Then he heard something moving in the kitchen. Rachel asked if he'd checked. "No." "Why not?" "Because I'm not an idiot." Then something slammed against the wall downstairs. Daniel went silent. 3 seconds later, someone knocked on the front door. 3 slow knocks. Daniel whispered, "Nobody's supposed to be here." Rachel told him to lock his bedroom door and call 911. He refused. "Daniel, call the police." "No." "Why?" He lowered his voice. "Because whoever it is knows I'm talking to you." The footsteps started. Someone was walking up the stairs. 1 step. Another. Then silence. Daniel locked his bedroom door. Rachel could hear him breathing. A knock came from the other side. 3 knocks. Exactly like the front door. Daniel whispered, "Who's there?" "Nothing." He moved toward the door. Rachel shouted, "Don't open it." Daniel put his hand on the knob. "Relax. It's probably some stupid prank." The knob moved. Daniel stepped backward. The door opened. Rachel heard a long silence. Then Daniel whispered, "Oh, shit." The call ended. Rachel called back. No answer. She called 911. Officers arrived 16 minutes later. The front door was locked. No broken windows. No damaged locks. No footprints outside. Daniel was gone. His phone was on the floor. His wallet was on the dresser. His car was outside. His shoes were beside the back door. Detective Harris arrived shortly after midnight and checked the security camera above the entrance. At 11:46 p.m., 3 minutes after the call ended, the front door opened. Daniel walked outside barefoot. He stood on the porch and looked directly into the camera. Then he smiled. Harris paused the footage. Why is he smiling? Nobody knew. Daniel turned around, walked back inside, and closed the door. That was the last time the camera saw him. Harris searched the house again and found the basement door locked from the inside. He broke it open. Daniel was lying on the concrete floor. Dead. No weapon. No obvious blood trail. No sign of a struggle. But he was still barefoot. Exactly as he had been on the camera. Harris looked around the basement. Then he noticed a black marker on the floor. On the wall beside it were 4 words. You should have listened. Rachel arrived 20 minutes later. The moment she saw the message, she stopped. Harris noticed. You recognize it? No. You recognized the words. Rachel didn't answer. Rachel. She finally whispered, my brother wasn't supposed to be here. What does that mean? She looked at Daniel. He promised he'd never come back. Come back from where? Rachel looked toward the basement. This house. Harris asked what happened there. Rachel hesitated. My brother was 17. And there were 4 boys. Daniel, Evan Cole, Michael Voss, and Stephen. What happened to Evan? Rachel looked at him. He disappeared. When? October 18, 1994. Harris looked down at his notebook. Same date. 25 years apart. Then Rachel said something that made the case even stranger. My brother didn't kill Evan. Harris frowned. I never said he did. Rachel stared at the basement. I know. Ya boss. That's when Harris realized this wasn't just a murder. Someone had killed Daniel on the exact anniversary of a disappearance. And whoever left that message wasn't warning him. They were reminding him. Daniel had spent 25 years trying to forget what happened in that house. Now somebody had made sure he couldn't forget it anymore. Detective Harris had spent enough years around murder scenes to know one thing: when a family member says, my brother didn't kill anybody, before you've even accused him, there's usually a reason. So he took Rachel into the kitchen and asked her to start from the beginning. October 18, 1994. Daniel was 17. Evan Cole was 16. Michael Voss was 17, and Stephen Parker was 18. They were 4 local kids who spent most of their time together, and that night they went into the woods behind Bellwether Road. According to the story they gave police, Evan had gotten into an argument with Daniel and walked away. That was the last time anyone supposedly saw him. Harris pulled out his notebook. Who found the boys? Rachel answered, Daniel and Michael came home around midnight. Stephen came back later. And Evan never came back. Harris asked why nobody had searched the woods that night. They did. Then how did they miss him? Rachel stared at the table. They didn't. That answer stopped him. What does that mean? Rachel lowered her voice. My mother told me something years later. She said Daniel came home covered in mud. His hands were shaking. He kept saying they had made a mistake. What mistake? She never knew. Harris asked where the boys had been. Rachel pointed toward the back of the house. There was an old trail behind the property. It led to a hunting cabin. Nobody used it anymore. Harris drove there before sunrise. The cabin had collapsed years ago, but something caught his attention immediately. A tree beside the ruins had a small symbol carved into its trunk. A circle. A line through the middle. Harris photographed it. Then he noticed something beneath the leaves. An old metal button. Police evidence from 1994 had never mentioned it. The button belonged to a jacket. And inside the ruined cabin, Harris found an old photograph. 4 boys stood in front of the same tree. Daniel. Evan. Michael. Stephen. The date on the back was October 18, 1994. Harris looked at Evan's face. Someone had drawn a black X over it. He returned to the station and pulled the original missing person file. There was almost nothing. No body. No weapon. No confession. Just 4 statements from 3 boys. Daniel had said Evan walked away. Michael had said the same thing. Stephen claimed he had left before the argument. But Harris noticed something strange. The statements had been written on the same type of paper, using the same black ink, and all three boys had described the argument with almost identical wording. That wasn't a coincidence. Harris called Michael Voss. The number was disconnected. He called Stephen Parker. Disconnected. Then he checked their addresses. Michael had moved to Nevada. Stephen was dead. Suicide. 6 months earlier. Harris sat back. 3 boys went into the woods. 1 disappeared. 1 was dead. 1 had vanished. And Daniel was now lying in his basement 25 years later. Then Harris received a call. It was Rachel. She was crying. "Detective, someone is outside my house." Harris asked what she saw. "A man." "What does he look like?" Rachel whispered, "I don't know. He's just standing across the street." Harris told her to lock the doors. Then she said, "He's holding something." "What?" "A photograph." Harris asked her to describe it. She went silent. Then, "It's me." Harris drove to her house. By the time he arrived, nobody was outside. Rachel was safe. But the photograph was still there. It had been pushed underneath her front door. Harris picked it up. It showed Rachel standing outside Daniel's house. The photograph had been taken that morning. On the back, someone had written, "You remember more than you think." Harris looked at Rachel. "What happened in those woods?" She shook her head. "I wasn't there." "Then why would someone send you this?" Rachel started crying. "Because Daniel told me something the night before he died." Harris waited. Rachel finally said, "He told me Evan didn't disappear. He was murdered." "No." She looked toward the window. "He was buried." Harris froze. "Where?" Rachel pointed toward the basement. "In this house." And suddenly the message on the wall made sense. "You should have listened." It wasn't written for Daniel. It was written for whoever was going to find him. And Harris had just realized that whoever killed Daniel probably knew exactly where Evan Cole was buried. The only question was why they had waited 25 years to dig him up. At this point, Detective Harris had 2 dead men, 1 missing boy, 3 witnesses, and a basement that looked more interesting than it had an hour earlier. He returned to Daniel's house with a forensic team before sunrise. The basement was sealed off, photographed, and examined. Nothing appeared unusual until one technician noticed a section of flooring that sounded hollow. "How big?" Harris asked. "About 4 feet by 3. They broke through the concrete. Underneath was old soil. Then came the smell." Harris stepped back. Everybody out except the forensic team. They kept digging. 20 minutes later, they found human bones. The remains belonged to a teenage boy. Dental records confirmed it before noon. Evan Cole. 25 years after he disappeared, they found him beneath Daniel Mercer's basement. The town exploded with rumors. Daniel had lied. Michael had lied. Stephen had lied. Someone had spent 25 years protecting that lie. Harris went back to Rachel and placed Evan's photograph on the table. "Your brother knew he was buried here." Rachel stared at it. "Yes." "When did he tell you?" 2 weeks ago." "Why?" "Because he was scared." "Scared of who?" Rachel looked toward the window. "He said someone had started calling the house." What did they say? Nothing. That doesn't make sense. They would just breathe. How often? Every night. Why didn't Daniel call the police? Rachel gave him a bitter smile. Because Daniel thought he could handle everything himself. Then Rachel remembered something. Daniel had kept an old box in his bedroom. Harris searched it. Inside were photographs from 1994, newspaper clippings, and a cassette tape. The label said, October 18th, don't play this. Harris played it anyway. The recording began with teenage voices. Daniel was arguing with someone. Evan was crying. Michael kept saying, "We have to go." Then Stephen shouted, "Shut up." A loud crash followed. Then Evan screamed. The tape ended. Harris played it again. Right before it stopped, another voice spoke. An adult male. Calm. Close to the microphone. "Leave him." Harris froze. That voice didn't belong to any of the boys. He sent the recording to forensic audio specialists. They cleaned the background noise. The voice became clearer. "Leave him here. Nobody will find him." Harris asked Rachel if she recognized it. She shook her head. No. Then she suddenly stopped. What? Rachel stared at the recorder. "I've heard that voice." "Where?" "Years ago." "Where?" "At my mother's funeral." Harris stared at her. "What was he doing there?" "I don't know." Before Harris could ask anything else, his phone rang. It was the police station. Michael Voss had been found. Dead. Nevada police discovered him inside his garage. His throat had been cut. There was no weapon. No forced entry. Written on the garage wall were the same 4 words. "You should have listened." Harris immediately understood. Daniel wasn't the beginning. He was the first name crossed off a list. He contacted Nevada detectives and asked for every piece of evidence from Michael's house. They found a photograph hidden inside Michael's desk. 4 teenagers standing in the woods. But there was someone else in the photograph. A man standing behind them. His face was partially hidden by a tree. He was wearing a black jacket. In his hand was a small silver lighter. Harris enlarged the image. The man was smiling. On the back was a handwritten sentence. 3 remembered. 2 lied. 1 forgot. Harris stared at it. There had been 4 boys. Evan was dead. Daniel was dead. Michael was dead. Stephen was already dead. That meant nobody from the original group was alive. Unless the message wasn't referring to them. Harris looked again at the photograph. The adult man was standing much closer to the boys than he had realized. He hadn't been watching from the woods. He had been with them. Then Rachel called again. Her voice was barely audible. "Detective? What's wrong?" "I found something in Daniel's room." "What?" "A key." "To what?" "I don't know." She described it. Old brass. Small. Engraved with the same circle and line. Harris told her not to touch it. Too late. Rachel had already picked it up. Then she heard something behind her. 3 knocks. Not at the front door. Not at a window. From inside the house. Rachel whispered. "Detective." Harris could hear her breathing. "What?" "Someone's in Daniel's basement." The call went silent. Harris grabbed his coat. He knew exactly where he was going. For the first time since the investigation began, he wasn't sure whether he was hunting the killer or walking directly into the killer's trap. Harris reached Daniel's house in less than 10 minutes. The front door was open, Rachel's car was still outside, and every light in the house was on. He drew his weapon before entering. Rachel? Nothing. He checked the kitchen, hallway, and living room. Empty. Then he heard something downstairs. A metallic sound. Click. Harris moved toward the basement. The door was open. He called Rachel again. No answer. He went down the stairs slowly and found her standing beside the old wooden table, staring at the floor. Rachel. She turned. Her face was pale. I heard someone down here. Where? She pointed toward the far wall. Harris looked. Nothing. Then he noticed the basement window. It was open. He moved toward it and found fresh mud on the floor. Someone had been there. Rachel suddenly grabbed his arm. Look. She pointed at the wooden table. The brass key was sitting on top of it. Harris had told her not to touch it. Now it was beside an old envelope. His name was written on the front. Detective Harris. He stared at Rachel. I didn't put that there. I know. He opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph. It showed Daniel, Michael, Stephen, and Evan in the woods in 1994. But this time, the adult man was clearly visible. Harris recognized him. His stomach dropped. The man was Detective Frank Mercer, Daniel's father. Harris had seen his photograph in the original case file. Frank Mercer had been the police officer who investigated Evan's disappearance. And according to the file, he had found nothing. Harris turned the photograph over. There was another message. Your police report was a lie. Rachel looked at him. What does that mean? Harris didn't answer. He was already thinking about the original investigation. Frank Mercer had been the lead officer. He had interviewed the boys. He had searched the woods. He had closed the case. And somehow, Evan's body had been buried beneath his own son's basement. Harris called the station and ordered the entire 1994 case file brought to him. While he waited, Rachel noticed something behind the furnace. A small metal door. Harris opened it with the brass key. Inside was a narrow compartment. There were newspaper clippings, photographs, and a cassette tape. On the tape was a date. October 19, 1994. Harris found an old player and pressed the button. Frank Mercer's voice came through. Evan Cole is dead. Rachel covered her mouth. The recording continued. Daniel didn't kill him. Michael didn't kill him either. Harris listened carefully. Then Frank said, Stephen did. Rachel whispered, that's impossible. But the recording wasn't finished. Frank continued. Stephen hit Evan. The others panicked. I found them before the police did. Harris froze. Frank had been there. He hadn't discovered the crime afterward. He had been there that night. Then Frank said something that made Harris stop the tape. The man in the woods told me what to do. Rachel looked at him. What man? Harris pressed play again. Frank continued. He said if I wanted my son to live, Evan had to disappear. The tape clicked. Silence. Then another voice appeared. The same calm adult voice from the first recording. Frank, you have one job. A pause. Make sure nobody remembers. The tape ended. Rachel started crying. Harris looked toward the basement window. The mud was still fresh. Someone had been inside minutes earlier. Then his phone rang. Unknown number. Harris answered. Nobody spoke. He waited. Finally, a man's voice whispered. You found the key. Harris stood completely still. Who are you? A quiet laugh came through the phone. You're asking the wrong question. What question should I ask? The voice answered. Why did Daniel call his sister before he died? Harris looked at Rachel. The call ended. Rachel suddenly remembered. Daniel hadn't called her to ask for help. He had called because he wanted her to hear something. The footsteps. The knocks. The voice. He had known he was going to die. And he wanted Rachel to know what was coming next. Harris looked at the basement wall. You should have listened. Then he realized something. The message wasn't written by the killer. It had been written for the killer. And whoever had left it wanted Harris to keep digging. Because there was still one person alive who knew exactly what happened on Bellwether Road. And Harris already knew where to find him. Stephen Parker had supposedly been dead for 6 months. But his death certificate had been signed by Frank Mercer. Frank had been dead for 20 years. Which meant somebody had been using dead men's names. And somebody had been protecting the secret ever since 1994. Harris didn't go home that night. He drove straight to the county records office and pulled Stephen Parker's death certificate. The document said Stephen had died 6 months earlier at a private rehabilitation facility in Salem. Cause of death, overdose. Simple. Too simple. Harris called the facility. The receptionist checked the records. Stephen Parker. Yes. A pause. Sir, we don't have anyone by that name. Harris looked at the certificate again. Your facility signed this death certificate. Another pause. That's impossible. Harris hung up. He had learned a long time ago, ya boss, that when paperwork starts contradicting reality, somebody has either made a very serious mistake or worked very hard to make you believe one. He drove to the address listed on the certificate. The building had been abandoned for 3 years. No patients. No staff. No records. Just empty rooms and broken furniture. Harris searched the place anyway. On the 2nd floor, he found a locked office. The door had fresh scratches around the handle. He forced it open. Inside was a desk, an old computer, and a file cabinet. The computer still worked. There was one folder on the desktop. Parker, Stephen. Harris opened it. There were photographs. Dozens of them. Stephen at 20. Stephen at 30. Stephen at 40. Stephen standing outside Daniel's house. Stephen standing beside Michael. Stephen entering Bellwether Road Cemetery. And then Harris saw the last photograph. Stephen was sitting at a table with Daniel. The photograph had been taken 2 days before Daniel died. Harris zoomed in. Daniel looked terrified. Stephen looked calm. But there was another person sitting at the table. Only part of his face was visible. Silver glasses. Black jacket. A silver lighter on the table. Harris stared at the photograph. Then he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Nobody. The office door slowly moved. Harris drew his weapon. Police. Silence. He stepped into the hallway. Nothing. Then his phone buzzed. A text message. You're getting close. Another message arrived immediately. Stop. Harris typed back. Who are you? 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. A final message came through. Ask Stephen. Harris looked at the photograph again. If Stephen was alive, he knew everything. The question was where he'd gone. Harris checked the computer's last activity. Someone had accessed the folder 12 minutes earlier. That meant whoever had been watching him had been inside the building. Harris searched the remaining rooms. He found a basement entrance behind a storage closet. The stairs led down into darkness. At the bottom was a narrow hallway. One door. Locked. He heard breathing behind it. Harris raised his weapon. Stephen Parker. Silence. Stephen, I'm coming in. He kicked the door open. A man was sitting in a chair. Older. Thin. Bearded. His hands were tied. Harris recognized him immediately. Stephen Parker. Alive. Stephen looked up. You took your damn time. Harris lowered his weapon slightly. You're supposed to be dead. Stephen laughed. Yeah. I've heard that. Who faked your death? Stephen's smile disappeared. Frank. Daniel's father. Stephen nodded. Why? Because he made a deal. With who? Stephen looked toward the ceiling. Then whispered. The man in the woods. Harris stepped closer. Who is he? Stephen shook his head. I never saw his face. You've seen him before. Everybody has. Harris stared at him. What does that mean? Stephen looked directly into his eyes. He isn't hunting us. Then what is he doing? He's cleaning up. Harris didn't like the answer. Cleaning up what? Stephen swallowed. The people who know what happened to Evan. Harris asked why Daniel was killed. Stephen looked away. Because Daniel finally remembered. Remembered what? Stephen's eyes filled with fear. He wasn't the one who buried Evan. Harris waited. Then who did? Stephen whispered. His father. Harris froze. Frank Mercer buried the body. Stephen nodded. But he wasn't alone. Who was with him? Stephen looked toward the basement door. The same 3 knocks echoed from somewhere upstairs. Knock. 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 Stephen's face went white. No. Harris turned toward the stairs. Who is that? Stephen grabbed his arm. Don't let him see you. Harris pulled away. Who? Stephen whispered. The man who was standing behind us in the photograph. The lights went out. Harris raised his weapon. A lighter clicked somewhere in the darkness. One small flame appeared at the end of the hallway. A man stepped into the light. Black jacket. Silver glasses. Calm smile. And in his hand was the same silver lighter Harris had seen in every photograph. He looked at Harris. Then at Stephen. And smiled. "Ya boss," he said quietly. "You really should have left this alone." Harris didn't move. The man stood at the end of the hallway with the silver lighter burning between his fingers. He looked relaxed, like he'd walked into a coffee shop instead of a locked basement. Stephen was shaking. Harris kept his gun aimed at the man's chest. Put the lighter down. The man smiled. That's your first mistake. Harris didn't blink. Second warning. The man looked at the gun. Then back at Harris. You police guys always think the gun is the interesting part. He snapped the lighter shut. Darkness swallowed the hallway. Harris heard Stephen yell. Then something crashed. Harris fired once and grabbed Stephen. Move. They ran as something struck the wall behind them. Harris kicked open a side door and dragged Stephen into an empty storage room. He slammed the door and locked it. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Stephen whispered. He's here. Harris looked at him. I noticed. No. You don't understand. Then explain. Stephen's breathing became faster. He doesn't kill people because they know the truth. Harris waited. He kills them because they try to tell somebody. A sound came from the hallway. 3 knocks. Stephen covered his mouth. How long has he been following you? 25 years. Who is he? I don't know. You've seen him. Not his face. You just saw his face. Stephen shook his head. That wasn't his face. Before Harris could ask, the storage room door handle slowly turned. Harris raised his weapon. The handle stopped. Then the voice came through the door. You two really don't know when to quit. Harris recognized it. The same voice from the cassette. Calm. Almost amused. You killed Daniel. No. Michael? No. Then who did? A pause. Daniel killed himself. Stephen looked at Harris. What? He knew what was coming. Harris shouted, You expect me to believe that? I don't care what you believe. Then the door opened. Harris fired. The bullet hit the wall. The hallway was empty. Stephen ran. Harris chased him upstairs. The front door was open. Stephen stopped. Someone had written across the living room wall. For boys. 3 liars. 1 witness. Harris looked at Stephen. Who was the witness? Stephen didn't answer. Stephen. He finally whispered. Daniel. Harris frowned. That doesn't make sense. He saw everything. What did he see? Stephen looked toward the basement. Frank didn't bury Evan alone. Harris waited. There was another man. The man in the woods. Stephen nodded. Frank was afraid of him. Why? Because he knew what Frank had done before that night. Harris asked what that meant. Stephen shook his head. I don't know. You've been running for 25 years and you don't know. I knew enough to stay alive. Then headlights appeared outside. A vehicle stopped in front of the house. Stephen backed away from the window. Who is that? Harris looked. An unmarked police car. 2 officers stepped out. Harris relaxed slightly. Then Stephen grabbed him. Don't. What? Those aren't police. The men approached the front door. 1 knocked. 3 times. Harris understood. He switched off the lights. 1 raised his weapon. A gunshot shattered the window. Harris pulled Stephen behind the couch. Another shot hit the wall. Stay down. The front door burst open. 2 men entered. Harris fired twice. One dropped. The other ran. Harris chased him into the yard. The man disappeared between two houses. Harris returned to the living room. Stephen was gone. His hands were still tied. Harris searched the house. Nothing. Then he noticed the basement door. Open. He went downstairs. The first attacker's body was gone. So was the blood. Only one thing remained. A silver lighter. Harris picked it up. On the bottom, 4 numbers were engraved. 101,894. October 18, 1994. Harris stared at it. Then his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. The same voice said, "You're finally starting to understand. Where is Stephen?" A quiet laugh. "Safe." "Where?" "Somewhere Daniel never found." Harris tightened his grip on the lighter. "You're not getting away with this." The voice became colder. "I'm not the one getting away." The call ended. Harris stood alone in the basement. Then he heard something behind him. A whisper. "Detective." He turned. Nobody. The whisper came again. From underneath the floor. "Help me." Harris froze. The voice belonged to a teenage boy. Evan Cole. And ya boss, that was when Harris realized something nobody had considered during the investigation. Maybe Evan hadn't been dead for 25 years. Maybe the body beneath Daniel's basement belonged to someone else. And if that was true, then somebody had spent 25 years making sure everyone believed the wrong boy was dead. Harris stayed in the basement for almost a minute without moving. The voice had come from underneath the floor. "Help me." He crouched and pressed his ear against the concrete. Nothing. Then 3 faint knocks came from below. Harris immediately called the forensic team. They returned to Daniel's house and opened the floor again. This time they dug deeper. About 3 feet below Evan Cole's remains, they found another layer of concrete. Harris stared at it. "Keep going." The team broke through. There was another body underneath. This one was smaller. A teenage boy. The medical examiner arrived and began the identification process. Harris didn't wait. He went back through the old case file and compared dental records. Evan Cole had a broken front tooth. The body they had found first had that exact injury. So the first body was Evan. But the second body was someone else. A few hours later, they identified him. His name was Caleb Mercer. Daniel's younger brother. He had disappeared in 1995. Harris stared at the report. Nobody had ever reported Caleb missing. Because according to the official records, Caleb had moved to California with his mother. That was a lie. Harris called Rachel. "Did you have another brother?" Silence. Then Rachel said, "Yes." "Caleb?" She started crying. "How did you find him?" "He was beneath Daniel's basement." Rachel stopped breathing for a second. Then whispered, "I thought he was alive." Harris asked what happened to him. Rachel said Caleb had been 14 when he disappeared. She remembered the night clearly. Daniel had come home late. His clothes were covered in mud. Caleb was gone. Their father, Frank, told everyone Caleb had run away. Rachel believed him. For years. Until now. Harris asked why nobody had reported him missing. Rachel gave him an answer that made his stomach tighten. Because my father told us Caleb didn't exist anymore. Harris went silent. What? He said if we talked about Caleb, we'd lose Daniel too. That sentence changed the entire case. Frank Mercer hadn't just covered up Evan's murder. He had buried his own son. Harris returned to the basement. The forensic team had found something else beside Caleb's remains. A small metal box. Inside was a photograph. Daniel was standing in the woods. Beside him was Evan. And behind them was Caleb. All three were looking toward the camera. Someone had written across the photograph. He saw too much. Harris turned the photograph over. Another message. The first boy was an accident. The second wasn't. Harris understood. Evan's death had started everything. Caleb had discovered the truth. So they killed him too. But there was still one question. Why had nobody known? Because Frank had erased his existence. Harris returned to Rachel. You need to tell me everything about your father. Rachel wiped her face. My father wasn't the man everyone thought he was. How bad? He was afraid. Of the man in the woods? Rachel nodded. He used to receive phone calls. When? Every October. From who? I don't know. What did the caller say? Rachel looked at Harris. One sentence. What sentence? She whispered. Your debt isn't paid. Harris felt his phone vibrate. A new message. Unknown number. A photograph. It showed Rachel sitting across from him. Taken from outside the house. Harris looked toward the window. Nobody. Another message arrived. You found Caleb. Then. Now find Frank. Harris stared at the screen. Frank Mercer had been dead for 20 years. But someone wanted him found. That meant either the killer was insane. Or Frank's death had been another lie. Harris immediately requested the death certificate. The document came back 10 minutes later. Frank Mercer had supposedly died from a heart attack on November 3, 1999. But there was something wrong. The signature of the doctor who certified his death belonged to a physician who had died in 1996. Harris stared at the document. 3 years before Frank's supposed death. He leaned back. For the first time, he understood the scale of what he was dealing with. Dead people were appearing alive. Alive people were being declared dead. Bodies were being buried under houses. And someone had controlled the records for decades. Then the basement lights went out. Harris reached for his weapon. A silver lighter clicked behind him. A flame appeared. The man in the black jacket stood beside Caleb's grave. He looked at Harris and smiled. You finally found the right family. Harris raised his gun. Who the hell are you? The man took one slow step forward. Ask Frank. Harris tightened his grip. Frank is dead. The man smiled wider. No, ya boss. He closed the lighter. That's exactly what he wants you to think. Harris kept his gun trained on the man. Where is Frank? The man didn't answer. Instead, he looked down at Caleb's remains. You've been asking the wrong questions. Harris stepped closer. Then give me the right one. The man smiled. Ask why Frank was afraid of Daniel. That caught Harris off guard. Daniel was his son. Exactly. The man turned toward the stairs. That's what made it interesting. Harris followed him with his weapon. Stop. The man stopped. Then he said, "You want the truth? Fine." He explained that Frank Mercer discovered Evan's body the night of October 18, 1994. Stephen had struck Evan during an argument, but Evan was already dead when Frank arrived. Frank could have called the police. He didn't. Instead, he made a deal: he would hide Evan's body if the boys stayed silent. But Caleb had followed Daniel into the woods that night. He had seen everything. Unlike the others, Caleb refused to keep quiet. Frank took him home. Then Caleb disappeared. Harris looked toward the second grave. "You killed Caleb." The man shook his head. "Frank did." "And you?" "I cleaned up what he left behind." "Why?" "Because Frank owed me." "Owed you what?" The man smiled. 25 years. Then the basement door slammed upstairs. Harris turned for half a second. When he looked back, the man was gone. Only the silver lighter remained. Harris grabbed it and ran upstairs. The house was empty. The front door stood open. Outside, an old black sedan disappeared down the road. Harris called for backup and followed it. The chase lasted 12 minutes. The sedan stopped beside an abandoned motel. Harris got out with his weapon drawn. The driver's door opened. Nobody was inside. Then he saw an old man behind the motel. Gray hair. Black coat. Harris recognized him from the photographs. Frank Mercer. "Frank." The old man turned. He looked exhausted, not surprised. "You found me. You're supposed to be dead." Frank smiled bitterly. "I was." Harris stepped closer. "You buried Evan." Frank didn't deny it. "Yes." "You killed Caleb." Frank looked down. "Yes." "Why?" "Because he saw the man." Harris stopped. "What man?" Frank looked directly at him. "The one you've been chasing." Harris felt his stomach tighten. "Who is he?" Frank whispered. "Disaster." The name meant nothing to Harris. He wasn't there to kill Evan. He wanted to see what we'd do. "Why?" Frank shook his head. "I don't know." Then a lighter clicked behind Harris. He turned. The man in the black jacket stood several feet away. Silver glasses. Calm expression. Zippo between his fingers. Frank stared at him. For the first time, Harris saw genuine fear on the old man's face. The man smiled. "Long time, Frank." Frank stepped backward. "You said you'd leave my family alone." Disaster shrugged. "You should have read the contract, your boss." Harris looked between them. "What contract?" Frank suddenly pulled a gun from his coat. Harris shouted. Frank fired. The bullet hit Disaster in the shoulder. Disaster stumbled. Harris tackled Frank before he could fire again. Disaster disappeared into the darkness. Harris cuffed Frank. For the first time in 25 years, someone was finally going to answer for Bellwether Road. But before they left, Harris noticed something on the pavement. A photograph. He picked it up. It showed Daniel, Evan, Michael, Stephen, and Caleb. 5 boys. Behind them stood Frank. And behind Frank stood Disaster. The photograph had been taken on October 18, 1994. Harris stared at it. There was one problem. Disaster looked exactly the same. Same face. Same glasses. Same black jacket. 25 years earlier. Harris turned the photograph over. 3 words were written on the back. This wasn't the first. And that's where the Bellwether Road case officially ended. Frank Mercer was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life. Evan and Caleb were finally buried under their real names. Michael's murder remained unsolved. Daniel's death was officially attributed to the same unknown killer. And disaster? Never found. But Harris kept the photograph. Years later, when someone asked why he had never closed the file, he gave the same answer. Because the man in that photograph didn't age. Then, on October 18, 2025, Harris received a package at his home. No return address. Inside was the silver lighter. And a handwritten note. "One more story, ya boss." Harris never reported the package. He locked the lighter inside a drawer. The next morning, the drawer was empty. And on his bedroom mirror were 4 words. "You should have listened."